Hey guys, Lewis here, and in today's conversation, I actually talked with someone really interesting, a professor and researcher, Dr. Jeff McQuillan. And so we talked about a bunch of things, namely, language learning strategies, obviously, research versus popular opinions when it comes to language learning. And we talked about language acquisition. Is it different when it comes to children versus adults? We also talked about the role of comprehensible input. We talked a lot about this. We talked about finding comprehensible input for language learning and the challenge of this comprehensible material. We talked a little bit about intentional learning as well, and we talked at the end a very interesting conversation on the role of AI in language learning and what would be sort of the best possible tool using AI for language learning. I really hope that you will like this conversation. I have included all the takeaways. If you don't have time to listen to the whole interview, I have included the takeaways as like a little summary of all the takeaways on my website. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to be doing this from now on. So let's go to the interview. All right, and now we are recording. All right, so in today's video, I have Dr. Jeff McQuillan with me for an interview, and I'm going to ask Jeff a bunch of questions related to language learning. The goal is for everyone listening and myself to learn better, more efficient strategies for learning languages. So Jeff, could you just start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Well, my name is Jeff McQuillan, as you said. I live in Los Angeles. I've been involved in language teaching since 1987, when I first taught English in Mexico as a recent college graduate. I became a Spanish teacher. I taught at the high school level, and then I taught at the college level. I went back and got my master's and PhD in the early 1990s. I studied under Dr. Stephen Krashen at the University of Southern California. I went on to become a university professor, and I did that mainly training teachers how to teach students in second languages. My research interests have sort of covered all different areas of language education, from reading, first language reading for little children, all the way up to bilingual education and foreign language education and second language education, which is what we're going to talk about, those kind of topics today. I was an academic sort of full-time for several years, and then in the early 2000s, I sort of broke off from academia. I continued to publish, and I publish articles and have done for the last 30 years. But now I'm more of an entrepreneur. I've been involved in language education sort of as a profession, as a teaching profession. I started the first language, my colleague and I started the first English language teaching podcast back in 2005, before anybody had ever even heard of podcasting. And we were the #1 language podcast for several years on iTunes across the world. And that's sort of been my main focus. ESLPOD.com was a website and podcast that we started. And now we don't produce new podcasts, but we have our materials. We produced something like 2,000 episodes with English lessons that we now have sort of repackaged into our website. So I'm kind of, nowadays, I'm part-time academic, I'm part-time entrepreneur. And I sort of do a little bit of both of those things. But my focus has always been on language education, and that's where I focus my attention.
So you mentioned that you've been publishing for the past 30 years. So you're also an entrepreneur in the field. So you get to see both perspectives of the research and just normal people like me. So in your opinion, what does the current research say about how people learn languages, or how people should learn languages, and how does it compare to how average people think they should learn languages?
Well, that's a really good question, Luis. There are always popular opinions about what language learning should look like. And we get those naturally from our own experiences, especially in classrooms. We go to high school or grade school, high school, college. We take language classes either voluntarily or are required to. And our notion of what language acquisition is comes from those experiences naturally. Where else would you get those ideas? We also get ideas from commercial programs, from things that we see in the library, from things that we see on the internet. All of these sort of give us our concept of what language learning should be. And as I think you're suggesting in your question, that's not necessarily what the research tells us is the best way to acquire a new language. People tend to have a idea about language learning that focuses a lot on, for example, studying a lot of grammar, a lot of conscious learning involved in grammar or vocabulary or whatever the area is, thinking that if they can just study things, they'll be able to then become fluent in a language. Whereas the research over the past 50, 60 years or so has shown us that, in fact, most of our language competency, most of our fluency comes not from this sort of conscious study, but rather from an unconscious process, what we call acquisition. We in the field sometimes distinguish between these two kinds of knowledge. There's learning, which is our conscious knowledge. That's the knowledge we get when we study, say, a grammar rule from a textbook. And then there's a much more important kind of knowledge, which is our unconscious or implicit or subconscious, if you will, knowledge. And that's the knowledge that we use most of the time. That's the knowledge we use without even thinking about it. That's the knowledge that you get when you're a little baby and your mother and father or your caretakers speak to you. Well, that's language is not something that you're studying out of a book. That's language that you're unconsciously or subconsciously acquiring. And it's that unconscious or subconscious language, it's that kind of knowledge that we're most interested in, because that's the one that's the most useful. So what we try to do as language researchers is to the best we can, by doing interviews like this and by publishing, is to sort of nudge people, push people in this direction, that what you really want to focus on is not so much language learning, not your conscious knowledge, not your ability to fill out a test and score correctly on a grammar quiz, but rather we want to push people towards getting their unconscious, their acquisition of language at a more fluent level. And those are two different processes, and therefore there are two different sort of approaches to getting there.
So is this different if you're a child, for example? I think most people would agree that, yes, okay, you acquire the language, you don't necessarily learn it. You don't have to learn it. You just, listen to it from your parents and from school, and then you acquire it. But is it different for adults? Because my understanding is that, well, when I went to school and I had to learn English and I had to learn Spanish, Spanish was quite a dismal failure, but I had to study these languages. And I think that even when you're not in school, I know that the Foreign Service Institute, for example, there is, a lot of deliberate study going on. Is this really necessary step, or can you just acquire languages just like a child?
Well, there are two good questions there. The first is language acquisition fundamentally different for a child than it is for an adult? And I think, as one of the previous people that you interviewed, Dr. Bill Van Patten, correctly points out, the underlying process for language acquisition is the same for all human beings at whatever age. It doesn't matter if you're a child or an adult, if you're a man or a woman, if you have blonde hair or blue hair, or like me, no hair. All of us acquire languages the same way. So the basic language acquisition device, if you will, that our brain, we think, is hardwired with, that works the same way for everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that the results are going to be the same for a child and for an adult. Not because our brain is different necessarily, although there's some disagreement about certain features of language which may be acquired easier, such as pronunciation when you're a child versus an adult. I don't want to get into the nitpicky details about that, but the basic idea is that language acquisition is the same. Children will often and typically will achieve higher levels of fluency in a second language, say, than adults. That's not because of a biological reason necessarily. That's primarily due to a couple of reasons. One, as Bill Van Patten pointed out in your previous interview, children have hours and hours and hours and hours of exposure to that language. They are given huge amounts of time to acquire a language, whereas adults usually have far fewer hours of exposure in any given language. So the differences in just the amount of language exposure is huge. Also, we have very low expectations for children, right? If a child can say a few words in a language, a young parent is absolutely thrilled, right? The first 7 to 9 to 12, perhaps even 14 months, a child doesn't say anything. But that's not because the child isn't acquiring language. The child is acquiring language during that entire period, but we don't expect the child to start speaking. Whereas adults, we walk into a foreign language classroom or a French classroom or a Spanish classroom, we expect ourselves to be speaking by the end of the first class, right? We have these unrealistic expectations of ourselves. So there are psychological reasons, but there are also simply reasons of time. Children tend to do better largely because of time, not because there's any sort of underlying difference. Now, the other part of your question, I've now forgotten. What was
I
the other?
talked about so the example was school or the Foreign Service Institute where there's a lot of deliberate learning going on. Is this useful at all?
Right. I'm sorry. Yes. Typically, when adults try to acquire a second language, they start with the learning part rather than the acquisition part. Typically, classrooms are set up and textbooks are set up to try to teach you consciously certain features of the language, whether that be your vocabulary or syntax or morphology or whatever it happens to be, pronunciation and so forth. Is it necessary? No. It's not necessary to have a conscious knowledge of the language in order to acquire it. In fact, we think these systems are different and they don't even interact with each other in any direct way. Again, there's some controversy about that, but for the most part, we tend to think of these systems as developing separately, implicitly and explicitly. Now, it's not necessary, although most adults, because their experiences with language learning have been so steeped in this tradition of studying things consciously, that most adults would be somewhat unsatisfied if they didn't feel like they were actually learning consciously certain things. So as a teacher, you might be, in fact, teaching certain teaching them rules about certain things because that feels like language learning, but your real agenda should be getting them more and more acquisition. It's not necessary to go through conscious learning, but most adults will insist upon it because it's simply part of what their own experience of language learning has been. It would be wonderful, however, if our education system and if language learning materials started introducing this new paradigm, this new approach, which would be to say, hey, it's not necessary to understand, to memorize these rules. What you really need to do is to be able to understand language, get what we call comprehensible input, understandable language, because that's going to be the key to improving your fluency, improving your acquisition.
And so, yeah, talking about comprehensible input, assuming that one were to say, okay, I subscribe to what Jeff McQuillan says, and I don't really necessarily need to do any learning, how would one go about doing this comprehensible input thing?
Let me just say for the benefit of your audience that on my own website, which is, I have a couple of websites, but the website that I have that I use for my research, if you will, is backseatlinguist.com. And you hopefully can put that in your show notes.
Put a link.
And on my website, I have a couple of videos, one of which is called Fundamentals of Second Language Acquisition, which was basically a lecture I gave a group of young English as a foreign language teachers. And in that video, it runs about an hour, I kind of go through in more detail these these theoretical, if you will, aspects of what language acquisition is. So I encourage those of you who are watching who are really interested in these topics to maybe take a look at that video. But going back, one of the things we talk about in the video, which is why I'm referencing it here, is this notion of what is comprehensible input and how do you get it. So it's a really core question that you're asking. Comprehensible input, just to give a brief definition, is language that you can understand. Now that may seem a pretty obvious kind of concept, right? Well, of course, languages understand. But in fact, if you're a beginner or an intermediate language acquirer, there's a lot of language that you will encounter that you will not understand, right? If I'm trying to learn, say, Chinese, and I turn on the television and I'm watching a Chinese language broadcast, well, that's going to be almost 100% incomprehensible input, right? It's going to be basically noise. I'm not going to be able to understand anything. We think that that kind of input is not useful at all in language acquisition. In other words, noise, incomprehensible language is not going to help you improve your language. I could sit there and watch that Chinese language television program for hours and hours and hours. And yeah, I might pick up a little phrase here, a little word there. Maybe one of the people on screen holds up a coffee cup and says cup, and then, I might pick up that one word. But for the most part, that's going to be a completely frustrating and useless experience in terms of my language acquisition. What we instead want to get is language that we can mostly understand. We may not understand it 100%, but we can mostly understand what the person is saying, or what the book is that we're reading is saying. That's the language that has potential to help us increase our language acquisition. When we can get input, when we can get language, and input is just another name for reading and listening, right? When we can read and listen to things that we understand, we're going to start acquiring the language that's embedded in that input. And that means the syntax, the vocabulary, the morphology, the semantics, all the different aspects of language that are part of being a fluent speaker and a fluent listener in a language. All of those are embedded, if you will, in the language we're listening. And our brain only needs to hear that and see that in a way that it can understand to be able to acquire it. We don't have to do anything special. All we have to do is find language that we can understand. I say understand, I often say mostly understand, because it's not necessary to understand 100%. But if you can understand most of what is being directed at you in terms of input, your brain will start acquiring it. You don't have to do anything. You just have to sit there, enjoy it, and understand it. And that's what comprehensible input is. Now, how do we get comprehensible input? Well, that's there used to be a show on American television, something like the $64,000 question. It was a quiz show of some sort back in the 1950s. And we sometimes use that as an expression. That's the $64,000 question, okay? How do you actually get comprehensible input? Well, it depends on where you are in your language acquisition journey. If you are a very beginner and you don't know anything, say, of Chinese or of Japanese, right? How are you going to get comprehensible input? The only way you're going to get comprehensible input in a language that you don't understand at all is by what we sometimes refer to as extra-linguistic cues. That is, things outside of the language. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about gestures. I'm talking about images. I'm talking about photographs. I'm talking about intonation of the voice. There are things outside of the language itself that will help you understand the language. One of the most popular or apopular language teaching method back in the 1960s and 70s was something called total physical response. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Luis. Total physical response. The entire method was based on the student watching the actions of the teacher. So the teacher would stand up and would say in French, or in the language of Spanish, stand up, and the kids would see, stand up. Oh, they began to realize that that's what those words meant. Just like when you're perhaps reading to a little child and you have the picture book in front of the child and you're pointing at the elephant and you're pointing at the giraffe, the child begins to associate those things that he or she is hearing with the image on the page. That's how you make input comprehensible to a beginner. You do it visually, or you do it kinesthetically, if you will, by gestures. All of these things are ways of making the language comprehensible. Now, eventually, you're going to be able to understand language just by the language you have already. You're going to be able to apply what you know to what you don't know. That's really the definition of all education, right? You're taking things that you know already and you're using those things, you're leveraging those things, if you will, to figure out what you don't know. So as you start moving up in your language acquisition fluency, you're going to be able to just listen to someone and use what you understand of them, of what they're saying, to figure out what you don't understand, what they're saying. So I may understand 90% of what you say, and I use that 90% to try to figure out what the other 10% is. That's the mechanism, if you will, of how we get comprehensible input. We take what we know and we apply it to what we don't know. So if I'm an intermediate language acquirer, I may be able to start reading books that are written, say, for third or fourth graders in native language, but they're simple enough for me to understand. They also contain things I don't understand, and I'm able to use what I understand to figure out what I don't understand. So comprehensible input is a matter of, I sometimes like to think of it as a matter of leveraging what you know to figure out what you don't know. And at the very beginning level, of course, you don't know anything. So that's why you need more and more visual or what we call extra linguistic information in order to try to figure out what the language that's being spoken or the language that you're reading. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to give you sort of general parameters of what getting comprehensible input would look like.
Yes, and I think you're touching on a very important issue, because as a language learner myself, I found that, at a higher level of proficiency, like for example, with my English, I can pretty much consume anything that I find on the internet or anywhere and benefit from it. If I meet an unknown word, I'm usually able to guess it from the context and so on. But I always found it very hard at lower levels of proficiency, beginner level, lower intermediate, even intermediate, getting material that is comprehensible and interesting at the same time. This is a real challenge. And so
it's a huge challenge.
Oh yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges in my opinion when learning a language.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about artificial intelligence and language learning, because I'd have to admit that up to about 6 months ago, I just thought that this whole ChatGPT thing was the hype train, just some other trend in the language learning world. But actually, when I really started taking a look at it seriously, I realized you can generate comprehensible input at the right level, but also, and I think this is a huge problem, because if you're learning one of the major languages, there is comprehensible input out there, but
yes,
you have to look for it, and also it's not always interesting to you, right? Depending on what you're interested in. And I don't think that necessarily the input being interesting is a requirement for you to benefit from it, but just because you need to spend so many hours reading and listening to the language to become fluent, I think it is important for it to be interesting. Otherwise, you're just going to get bored. So hypothetically, let's say that I'm a software developer, and I'd like to to use my programming skills to use AI and develop, I don't know, graded readers or maybe graded listeners, and use this technology to create something that would really benefit language learners. What would you make if you were me?
That's a great question. Before I answer that, can I just touch on this issue of interesting and comprehensible? Because that's a really interesting point. And I haven't talked, normally when I talk about this, I talk about comprehensible and interesting. And I didn't really hit on the interesting part when I talked about comprehensible input previously. First of all, you're absolutely correct. If it's not interesting, you're not going to continue with it. You may benefit from it still, but it's a matter of being able to sustain it. It's like a diet that's good for you, but if it's so hard that you can't stay on your diet, well, then really it's not a very good diet, right? And that's true for a lot of activities. If you're doing exercises and you hate them, well, you're not going to probably do them for more than a couple of weeks, and therefore you lose that consistency. And consistency is really important in language acquisition. Getting that 5-10 minutes, even if it's 5-10 minutes a day, that's going to make a difference cumulatively over time, right? It's a matter of time. We talked about that when we talked about children versus adults. So you want to get as much time as you can being exposed to the language in a comprehensible way. Steve Crash and I had a little exchange on email a few months ago. We talked about this issue because for people like Steve and people like myself or like you, and probably like many of the people who watch your videos, we sort of love this whole language acquisition thing, right? We're excited to learn a new language. It's something that interests us. Maybe we're interested in language per se, beyond just the communicative possibilities of it. For people like us, comprehensible input is often enough, especially at the early stages. For example, when I was starting in on French and Italian, if I could understand it, I would be happy. That was enough for me. But there reached a point after about 2 or 3 months of, say, reading French, reading this, that was comprehensible input, but it wasn't interesting. It was kind of dull, but it was enough because I was excited because I could understand it, right? That was the sufficient high for me. That was enough to give me that little dopamine hit, okay? But there came a point in my French and my Italian when comprehensible just wasn't enough. It had to be interesting. Otherwise, I was like, this is too boring. I don't want to do that. And one of the first things I did, therefore, when ChatGPT came online, I was one of the first people. I went and got on there right away as soon as the general public could use it. The very first prompt I put in was, tell me a story in simple French tell me a mystery story in simple French based on a Agatha Christie novel, using no more than the first 1,000 most commonly used words in French. Boom. And it spit something out. Now, it wasn't fascinating, and ChatGPT and the LLM models are not really great still at producing fascinating fiction, but it was more interesting than other stuff I read. Or I would say, I'm a big nonfiction reader, as I think you are too. So I would say something like, I was reading something on the history of ancient Egypt. Tell me the history, give me a brief overview of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. There it was, in simple French, okay? So it immediately spit out stuff for me to read. The interesting part is really important, and that's something that you can now do with something like ChatGPT or one of the other LLMs. Okay, getting back to your question then, what would you do as a programmer? Well, Paul Nation made a very good point in his interview and your interview with him. And it's a point that I've made to people before as well, which is we live in a world, unfortunately, in which there are two circles. There's one circle over here that represents all of the programmers, okay? The people who have technical knowledge of these new advances, and then we have another circle over here of people who know something about language acquisition. And unfortunately, these two circles don't intersect. Okay, if this were a Venn diagram, right? There's two circles and there's no intersection. We have almost nobody working in the language acquisition field who also has the technical capabilities to do things like create a Duolingo or a Rosetta Stone and so forth. And unfortunately, the result of that is that everything that comes out it doesn't matter what the new technology is, it's the same old crap that used to be, that you could find back in the 1950s. Pardon my French, as we say, right? It's the same old junk that you could have found back in the Foreign Service Institute exams from, courses from 1955. That's the real issue that we face here. The people, my sister used to work for 3M, not for 3M, I'm sorry. My sister used to work for IBM. And they had a saying in her division, a fool with a tool is still a fool. Just because you have a tool like AI, if you don't know how to use it, you're still a fool. If you don't know what language acquisition theory tells us, and language acquisition methodology tells us is a good thing, well, then you're not going to be able to produce anything better than what we used to have. You're just going to put it in a different format. And I'm afraid that's exactly what will happen. If you go to ChatGPT right now and you type in, I want to learn Spanish, give me some beginning Spanish lessons. You know what it's going to give you? My guess is, here are some grammar rules. Here are some words to memorize, right? It's going to give you the same junk. What we want, someone like you to do is to jump in and say, okay, let's create a course where everything is comprehensible from the very beginning. As an entrepreneur, I can tell you that the money to be made in the language learning market, here's a little secret. For everything but English, all of the money is at the bottom. The language learning market internationally is, well, I won't say internationally. In the United States, the language learning market is a pyramid, okay? Everybody goes through Spanish 1 and 2, and almost nobody makes it to the top, which means all of the language learning materials, most of them are going to be found at this lower level if they exist at all. If you could create a course that was comprehensible from the very beginning using a ton of image generation, which unfortunately ChatGPT is not great at yet, okay? And if you've used ChatGPT or one of the LLMs, you know what I'm talking about, right? You tell it to, produce an image with a man on an elephant, and it'll produce an image with a man standing next to an elephant. You say, no, put the man on top of the elephant, and you'll produce another image with a man behind the elephant. No, put the bloody guy on top of the elephant. So it's very frustrating. I do this all the time. I produce a weekly ESL newsletter for people who subscribe to our services and who follow us. And I use a lot of images. So I'm using ChatGPT every day to produce images that relate to the content of whatever the lesson is that I have in my email. And it's a constant frustration. But that's exactly what we would want. We would want a course that is fully visual, but has lots of comprehensible input, that tells simple, interesting stories. They don't even have to be great stories, but as long as they're mostly comprehensible and relatively interesting, that would be a huge benefit. Are you familiar with Rosetta Stone? They're not as popular now as Duolingo, but you know what they do, right? They have four pictures. Duolingo kind of stole their formatting in a way, didn't they? They basically took a bunch of pictures, and then they're constantly quizzing you, which I find really annoying. You don't get better by being quizzed necessarily. You get better by getting good comprehensible input. Don't give me the bloody quiz. Just give me the comprehensible input. Rosetta Stone was onto something, but they didn't know what they had. They instead, what they should have done is they should have taken photos and created a simple story, and then created another simple story that built on the vocabulary of the first story, and then the third story that built on the vocabulary of the first two stories, right? You could easily start covering those first, 500, 1,000 word families. You use that as your sort of guiding principle, but mostly the most important principle is you're writing interesting stories and you're making them comprehensible by the extra linguistic cues. Now, of course, as you move up into the intermediate levels where you don't need as much visual, right? Again, the pattern is already there. Go to a library or go to a bookstore, if there are still bookstores in the world. I think there are. Go to a bookstore and look at the children's section and notice that the first books that you introduce to kids are just picture books. They're nothing but pictures. And the parents are expected to go through and talk about the pictures. And then the next level, there are just a few words on the bottom of the page. And then the next level, there's sentences at the bottom of the page. And then at the next level, you get up to the point where there's one page of text and one page of image. And then finally, you get up to the level where there are no images because you have enough language to make sense of the language that you don't understand. That leverage principle that we talked about earlier in the interview. So my general recommendation, and by the way, I've been making this recommendation since like 1998. Okay, I used to go out and give talks to language teachers throughout the United States. I probably talked to 5,000-10,000 different teachers over a period of 2 or 3 years in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I would end my talks every day talking precisely about this. Hey, teachers, if you really want to make a contribution to language acquisition, Here's what you need to do. And I would explain it to them, and everybody would nod and go, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. But nothing happens. so I'm giving you my best stuff here, Luis. I'm saying here's what would really make a difference. The technology is already there, and as you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be reading. You could just have listening, or you could have both, right? You could have, which I think would be ideal, right? You can read along as well as listen. Imagine having hundreds, not just a couple. We need hundreds and hundreds of interesting stories in beginning Japanese that you can listen to and follow along with, just like a kid would, or just like you would on, captions on the TV, that you can follow along with and just enjoy listening and reading to those stories without having to do anything else. If you could do that, that would be a huge contribution to language acquisition at the practical level.
I've been thinking about something similar in the past few weeks, not necessarily with images, but I've always liked graded readers, but in languages other than English, there are some, but then they're just not enough. I mean, it's just you can read all of them, and you still need to read more if you want to be fluent. So, yeah, I think with AI, could generate tons of reading material. And personally, I've been thinking about not necessarily fiction, because I'm not really sure how good ChatGPT is at generating fiction, but non-fictions. For example, a series of books in easy Japanese about, I don't know, life in Japan and, how to live in Japan and stuff like that with images. But so in terms of the images, would you say that it would need to be like a bunch of images, or does it need to just be, a few images, 2 images per page, or something that is not too frequent?
Yeah, I've experimented with this idea myself. Unfortunately, I'm not a very good artist, but I don't think it needs to be complicated. I don't think you need like a DC Comics, Marvel Comics level kind of, or manga comic kind of detail. In fact, in some ways, that's a disadvantage at the beginning level because it's distracting. So if you're going to talk about I kicked the ball, you just want a person, the kicking action, and a ball. If you have a table and a chair and a forest behind you or whatever, that's just going to distract you as a person looking at that. I'm thinking, oh, are they talking about the forest? Are they talking about the ball? Are they talking about the chair? You want to keep it at the beginning level anyway. This is my instinct. Okay, my instinct is, it's not based on any sort of research, but just based on sort of my common sense approach would be keep it simple visually. The visual only has to be complicated enough to make the input that the person is listening to comprehensible. That's it. Okay, it just has to determine, if we will, the text. You don't want to clutter it up with a lot of other stuff. It just has to be enough to make it comprehensible. Yeah. In terms of the graded reader idea, of course, I agree with you. There's lots of room for development. ChatGPT doesn't do very well at fiction right now. It can. What I found in my experiments with it early on was that it was okay at doing what we would call pastiche, which is sort of here's what I did. I would give it a story that I knew was not in copyright protection in the United States, so before 1920, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is. So early Agatha Christie stories, detective fiction, which I'm interested. I kind of like fiction, detective fiction. And I would say use that story and just simplify it, make it easier. Or I would say put it in a modern context and make this character male and this character female. Yeah, I would sort of change up the details of it. Then it can do okay, and then it can start producing dialogue, which of course is very useful because you also want to get that conversational language in there, not just not just the descriptive language.
Oh, okay, right. So assuming that in an ideal world, I were to generate these books, let's say, for example, a graded reader of about, let's say, 300 pages of pure just language, how many of these would someone need to read? And let's assume that I also generate the audio for it using, AI. Then
Yeah.
someone would just read and listen to this all the time for many hours a day. How many of these graded readers would someone need to consume to really reach a, let's say, at least conversationally fluent level in a language? And I'm assuming here
Yeah.
that it really depends on the language as well, but in
Well,
general.
it does, and I'm afraid I have to give the same answer that Bill Van Patten gave, which is that it's really an impossible question to answer because we don't really know. All we know really is what people have been able to do in the past based on X number of hours in what was probably pretty lousy instructional settings. Uh, that I think the Foreign Service Institute or one of the Defense Language Institute or one of the U.S. government organizations came up with this chart of how many hours you would need. Maybe you're even familiar with this, and I forget it was. And of course, it does make a difference whether you're a French speaker learning Spanish and you're a French speaker learning Japanese, right? Two different things because obviously Spanish is much more comprehensible to you. By the way, the reason it's easier to acquire is really because it's more comprehensible. The language, the vocabulary is more cognate. The grammatical structures are more cognate. But the most important thing is it's more comprehensible. So when I'm picking up French and Italian, it's much easier for me than if I were to pick up, even German, although obviously the English helps with the German. So that's why I'm like Bill. I'm going to not be able to answer your question with a real answer. I would say, you can kind of look at how well people do in a traditional classroom after 2 semesters of a language. I don't know. I know in the EU you guys have this ranking system with A1
Yeah,
and
A1, yeah.
B2 and yeah. I don't claim to understand it. I don't really know what those things are. We don't use them here, but we use something called the ACTFL levels. Okay, the American Council of Teaching Foreign Languages, and I think they say that after a year or two of Spanish, you should be at sort of ACTFL level 2, which is sort of low intermediate. These things are all very imprecise. I would say it's going to depend on a lot of things. If you were getting pure comprehensible input, however, for, I don't know, 500 hours, so I don't know, let's say you did it, well, if you did it 10 hours a day, theoretically, you could, in 50 days, you could probably be sort of at a lower intermediate level or upper beginner level. I would
Okay.
imagine, but
Yeah.
but again, that's just sort of there's so many variables involved, Luis, that it would be very difficult to sort of put a figure on it. I do think that 2 things are true. One, if you got a lot of pure comprehensible input, you would go much faster than you would in a traditional program, much faster. Okay. 2, most people's expectations are higher than the reality. Okay, so even though you would go much faster, a lot of people still think that, well, if I just studied another 20 hours, I could be up here. No, it doesn't work that way. The brain has its own timetable, right? And it's going to take time for the brain to acquire things. Here's something to think about. The third person singular S in English, I go, he go, she goes, right? You add an S to the end for third person singular. That's an extremely easy grammatical construction. We can teach that on day 1 of an ESL class. There are people who have lived in the United States for decades who, when they're in conversation, will still miss the third person singular S. They'll still say, he go to the store instead of he goes to the store. That's because the language acquisition device has its own agenda. And just because you get lots and lots of input doesn't mean you're necessarily going to acquire everything. However, I still would say, in the optimistic side of things, if you had good, pure, comprehensible input, you could make significant progress in, say, 500 to 1,000 hours. I mean, I'm pretty sure, even if it were in a language, say, going from French to Japanese. The problem is that's such a rare case. The reason we don't really know is because we almost have have almost no instances when somebody has been exposed to that level of quality input for a given amount of time. That's the problem. Once you create this course, Luis, however, then we can start researching this properly. Get on
Nice.
it.
Yeah. But in terms of the format of this hypothetical course, would it be, because you're saying course, so it would be as a, not really a textbook, but just a book, or would it be an online resource? What do you think?
I mean, the formatting, how you actually market it and package it, that would depend. You'd have to experiment with that. It wouldn't be, if I were to do something like that, it would almost certainly be a course that I would, have it as an online thing. They maybe put it in an app. It depends what the final product looked like and how it would actually go. By the way, 10%. That's my cut. Okay, please.
Yeah.
Yeah. He said, no, I tell you, we're record. Don't cut this out. Don't edit this out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about doing anyway. So
Good for you. Good for you.
yeah, and also just for myself, honestly, get a lot of
Yeah.
reading material and listening
Yeah.
material in Japanese and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
okay, Jeff. Well, this has been great. I want to be respectful of your time. And do you
Appreciate it.
have any last words in terms of where people can find you and find your material?
Yeah. Well, for those of you, and I suspect most of the people who are interested watching the video are already either fluent English speakers or, like yourself, amazingly good second language speakers. Backseat Linguist, BACKSEATLINGUIST.com is where you can find some of my research. I post there, sort of whenever I do something, which is sometimes 4 months can go by or 6 months can go by before I do it. It's really aimed at my fellow researchers and people like yourself who are interested in language education issues. And there's all sorts of stuff on there, including links to videos. My website, my professional website, I and my colleague have a website called eslpod.com, which is for people who are sort of intermediate to advanced language acquirers who are looking for written and audio materials. That's where you can find sort of my take on the intermediate language teaching world. And I want to thank you for the interview. It's been a blast. Maybe we can come back and do it again, talk about some of these topics that we maybe didn't get time to today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thanks.